We've had a lot of great guests throughout the year. And for those of you that are not familiar with David Heinemeier Hansson, he's one of the more popular people, I would say, in the tech industry. He's co-founder and CTO of a company called 37 Signals, which is the maker of a product called Basecamp. Now, Basecamp itself is not 37 Signals is not a big company. Not at all. It's under 80 employees. I think they have 70. But what makes him and his business partner, Jason Fried, quite interesting is they seemingly have this ability to do so much with so few. If you're thinking about resources or people, they do more with less than anybody else, arguably, in the industry. Probably Craigslist does the most with less. I think Craigslist revenue is like $1 billion a year, and they only have 50 employees. They're not quite Craigslist, but they are vocal. And so we get to hear their voices quite often. And I think the fun part about meeting David this past year was he kind of supported, I think we all have a little confirmation bias in the way we do things. And he supported what I believe in, which is like, there's probably a really great way to do something that's not as hard. Yeah, well, I gravitate towards being able to do more with less. Being huge is never an interest of mine. I'm not really sure what, some people, they aspire to be a billionaire. Fantastic. I don't know what you're doing that I can't do, because the number one thing I enjoy the most is being out in the middle of the ocean surfing. And last time I checked, whether you have $1 billion or $10, like, dude, I'm going to have the same amount of fun when I do that. Now, other things you get to do better than me, for sure. But when I think about, we're about to play a clip from David inside of 37 Signals Basecamp, how they started this company was this idea of fierce independence. So that itself is a culture, which is we want to stay small, we want to stay lean, we want to experiment. And so he and they have built a company that defined that. So, they've been on the wrong side, or maybe on the negative side of public light as well, because they had a policy once come out where they say, hey, we're no longer going to talk about politics. And that is a thing. And people raised their hand and said, I don't want to be a part of that. I'm leaving you. And they kind of said, understood. And they were willing to sacrifice losing some really great people, but they held firm to what they believe in. And so they have a set standard of how they operate the company. They're kind of like David as well, in that they don't think you need to know everything. You just need to know a direction. You guys sound like you're making intuitive jumps. Give our audience an idea of how much data do I really need? And because you hit on it already, which is people will not provide any data to what they actually want. If you ask them to show you data, it's probably the same as asking them what they want, right? They'll just want to improve what they're currently doing.
Right.
They don't actually know what they need, in the future.
They don't. And you know what? The data won't tell you either. We are not a data-driven organization in that regard. We are an organization driven on intuition and experience. And those two things are sometimes very hard to quantify, but they allow you to make those kind of leaps that the lack of data keeps many organizations from making. There are a lot of organizations who've been enthralled with this sort of Google motto of, do you know what, we have to pick a shade of blue. Let's try 129 different versions of it, and we'll A/B the whole thing to the moon, and we'll pick the one, whatever that does best, right? Which is a great way of getting these local optimas, local maximizations that does not consider the entire picture. And I think this is one of these errors of getting captured by data. And in this data spewing world that we have today, where literally there are faucets of data just open, spewing out everywhere, it seems like that is the logical, rational thing to do. To be data-driven is a compliment in most circles. I don't actually think it's a compliment, not as a overarching strategy for how you run product. No, you need to be intuition driven. That intuition should be informed by some data, some of the time, to some of the questions where that makes sense. I've found that there are fewer of the important questions that can be answered by data. And if you try to push it too hard, then you end up in a bad place. And the problem here is that relying on intuition means relying on someone who's then possibly to blame, which means that it relies on literal courage. In the face of the unknown, do you dare go forth with your best ideas for how things should work? And if those ideas come up flat and don't turn out, what happens then? In some organizations, maybe you get your head chopped off, right? In our organization, we accept that we will be wrong. This intuition will take us down blind alleys sometimes. And when we hit a blind alley, we say, oh, well, that's the price of having an intuition. Let's turn back and go the other way. And that's fine. Most decisions, most of the times, are reversible, particularly when it comes to product development. And it's the only way you can develop this kind of intuition is by making calls, many of them, moving on and keeping up the pace. This is the other problem with data. It takes too damn long.
It's expensive
to collect the right
too.
data. It's expensive to collect. It's
Yeah.
complicated to actually get right. You really need people who can figure it out. If we had to base every decision we make at 37 Signals on data, we would never make even 100th of the decisions that we're making. And we need to be making decisions all the time and moving on, because this is how we can keep the pace.
This is the kind of conversation I'd love to be in there with you, Albert. I mean, what a cool cat. And I mean, I love the fact that he's talking about how much they value intuition. But I think on the flip side of that, you can quantify that. You can quantify the results of that. If like, hey, if you know, there may not be historical, success, but they're obviously trusting this intuitive pulse in the company, and it's led to things that they certainly can quantify. But I just love how he is really saying the opposite of what a lot of companies are saying when it comes to this stuff. And yeah, what do you think, Steph?
I mean, yeah, when he talked about the Google, all the blue colors, I'm like, yep, that's a lot of the teams that I worked around where they're like, hold on, we got to A, B, Z, X test this. And I'm like, pretty sure we already, survey everyone in this team and everyone outside. Like, I don't know. The one thing that I was thinking about was I was interviewing an executive from Pepsi. She and I were talking about like AI models and how many companies are like AI everything. And many of these models were trained off of poor history, were trained off of 2021, 2022, and consumers are very different than how they might be over the coming years. And so that was what was coming to mind around like how to tap into your intuition more of like, okay, I know the model's telling me this, but this actually feels like 2020 predictions and not go for predictions, because we're changing every single minute. I mean, consumers are so different where we are today versus 2 months ago or whatever. So that's a trap that I think companies can get into, especially when it comes to like predictive modeling, if you're using false historical data. Well, it was true in the time, but it's not true going forward. So got to be careful.
100 bajillion%. Is that a number? Because
oh, it is.
No, data can only tell you what has happened. It is no way of indicating or predicting the future. And if it can, you're probably measuring something quite small. And that's something David talks about or DHH as he's known. He talks about like, hey, if you're making all this measurements to make a small change, you will need even more measurements to see what it did. And he basically said, you're basically going after the smallest things. He says, if you're going to do something big, there's going to be no number to prove that this is going to work. This episode of IT Visionaries is brought to you by Salesforce. With Salesforce's low-code app dev tools, you can be more efficient, more productive, and save money by reducing development time by up to 90%. Get Salesforce's low-code playbook and increase time to value for your team and your customers. Visit salesforce.com/ITV today.